I never thought a bag of rock salt would be the thing that brought down an entire HOA board. But life in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision had a way of surprising me in the worst possible ways. My name is Derek Peterson, and I've lived in this cookie-cutter neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio, for about 3 years now. The house was perfect for me after my divorce, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a decent backyard and enough space to finally have that workshop I'd always wanted. What I didn't account for was the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, specifically its president, a woman named Brenda Calloway, who treated neighborhood management like it was her personal fiefdom. The whole salt situation started in early December, when the weather reports were predicting one of the worst winters Ohio had seen in decades. I'm a contractor by trade, which means I know the value of preparation and having the right supplies on hand. So when I saw that forecast, I did what any sensible person would do. I drove out to the hardware supply store and bought myself 10 bags of rock salt, plus another 5 bags of the premium ice melt that works down to -20 degrees. I stacked them neatly in my garage, figuring I'd be set for the season while everyone else was scrambling when the first big storm hit. That first snowfall came the week before Christmas. 6 inches overnight, and the temperature dropped to 15 degrees. I was up at 5 in the morning, spreading salt on my driveway and sidewalk, making sure everything was clear and safe. By 7, I was finished and heading inside for coffee when I saw Brenda marching up my driveway. She was wearing this ridiculous pink parka that made her look like an angry marshmallow, and her face had that pinched expression she always got when she was about to make someone's day worse. "Derek," she called out, not even bothering with a good morning. "I need to talk to you about your salt supply." I stopped at my front door, coffee mug in hand. "My what?" "Your salt. I saw you out here this morning, and you clearly have quite a stockpile." She gestured toward my garage like she'd been surveying my property. "Several residents have run out, and as a member of this community, you have a responsibility to share your resources." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. "Brenda, I bought that salt with my own money. If people need some, they can go to the store." Her expression hardened. "The stores are sold out. There's a shortage because of the storm predictions. As HOA president, I'm invoking Section 7 of our community guidelines, which states that residents must act in the best interest of the community's welfare and safety. Section 7 is about not letting your house fall into disrepair," I said. "It's got nothing to do with my personal property. I'm interpreting it to include emergency supplies during crisis situations," she said, pulling out her phone. "I'm sending a community-wide email right now, letting everyone know you're refusing to help your neighbors. You can't be serious," but she was already typing. "We'll see what the community thinks about your selfishness, Derek." She turned and walked away, her boots crunching on the salted driveway that I'd cleared with my own supplies. I stood there, feeling that familiar anger rising. This was exactly the kind of petty tyranny that made HOA horror stories go viral online. Within an hour, my phone was blowing up. Emails, texts, even a few Facebook messages from neighbors I barely knew. Most of them were reasonable people asking if I'd be willing to sell them some salt at cost, which I would have been happy to do if Brenda hadn't turned it into this weird moral crusade. But mixed in were some nasty messages clearly influenced by Brenda's email, calling me selfish and unneighborly. I responded to the reasonable requests, telling people I'd sell them salt for exactly what I paid. But I also started documenting everything. Every email from Brenda, every message from neighbors, every interaction. My ex-wife used to say I was too meticulous about keeping records, But 3 years of dealing with HOA nonsense had taught me that documentation was everything. The next day, Brenda showed up again, this time with 2 other board members. Margaret Foster and Linda Chen stood behind her like backup singers, both of them looking uncomfortable but nodding along to whatever Brenda was saying. "Derek, we've had a board meeting and we've decided to impose a fine," Brenda announced. $200 for failure to comply with community welfare standards. "You can't fine me for not giving away my property," I said. "We can fine you for violating HOA guidelines," Brenda countered. "And unless you want that fine to increase, I suggest you make your salt available to the community. We're setting up a distribution system. You'll provide the salt, and we'll ensure it's distributed fairly." "Absolutely not," Margaret spoke up, her voice tentative. "Derek, maybe we could work something out. The HOA could reimburse you for the cost, at wholesale prices," Brenda cut in quickly. "We're not paying retail markup." I looked at Margaret, who seemed like she was at least trying to be reasonable, then back at Brenda. "Let me get this straight. You want to take my property, distribute it however you see fit, and pay me less than I actually paid for it." "It's for the good of the community," Brenda said. "Then the community can go to the store like I did." "The stores are still sold out," Linda said quietly. "People are really struggling." "Mrs. Henderson down the street fell on her walkway yesterday." That made me pause. Mrs. Henderson was 83 and lived alone. "Is she okay?" "Bruised hip, but she's fine," Linda said. "But it shows why this is important." "I'll take some salt to Mrs. Henderson myself," I said. "In fact, I'll help any elderly residents who need it. But I'm not turning over my supplies to the HOA so Brenda can play distribution coordinator." Brenda's face went red. "You're getting another fine. $400 total now. And if you don't comply by the end of the week, we'll put a lien on your property." "Try it," I said. "I'd love to see you explain to a judge why I should be forced to give away my personal property." They left, and I immediately went inside to start making calls, first to Mrs. Henderson, who was indeed sore but grateful when I brought over a bag of salt and spread it on her walkway. Then to 3 other elderly residents in the neighborhood who I knew lived alone. Finally, I called my buddy Marcus, who happened to be a lawyer, though his specialty was corporate law, not HOA disputes. "Man, that's insane," Marcus said after I explained the situation. "They definitely can't force you to give up your property. The fine is probably unenforceable too, but you'd have to challenge it formally." "What about the lien threat?" Total bluff. "They'd need a judgment first, which they won't get. But Derek, here's my advice. Document everything, and I mean everything. Date, time, who was present, what was said. Keep copies of all emails and texts. If this escalates, you want a paper trail." "Already on it," I said. "Good. And one more thing, watch for them overstepping in other ways. People who abuse power in one area usually do it in others. If she's this aggressive about salt, she's probably been pushing boundaries elsewhere." That conversation stuck with me. I started paying more attention to the HOA's activities, actually reading through the meeting minutes and financial reports that got emailed out monthly. And that's when things got interesting. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA collected dues of $300 per household quarterly. With 240 homes in the subdivision, that was $72,000 per quarter, or $288,000 per year. According to the financial reports, about 60% went to the landscape company that maintained the common areas, another 20% to insurance and utilities for the small community center, and the rest to administrative costs and reserves. But when I actually looked at what the landscape company was doing, something felt off. The common areas consisted of the entrance monuments, a small park with a playground, and the landscaping around the community center. That was maybe 2 acres of maintained space total. I'd done enough contractor work to know that even with weekly mowing and seasonal plantings, that shouldn't cost more than $30,000 a year, maybe 40 tops. They were supposedly paying $170,000. I pulled up the vendor information. Callaway Landscape Services, LLC. Owner, Richard Callaway, Brenda's husband. I sat back in my chair, staring at my computer screen. This was either a massive coincidence or exactly the kind of corruption Marcus had hinted at. I started digging deeper, going back through 3 years of financial reports. Every year, the landscape contract got bigger. 3 years ago, it had been $90,000. Last year, $150,000. This year, $170,000. And every year, the scope of work described in the report stayed basically the same. I needed more information. The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks, but the bylaws stated that any homeowner could request copies of contracts and financial records with written notice. I drafted a formal request that evening, asking for copies of the landscape services contract, invoices, and proof of work performed for the past 3 years. I sent it certified mail the next morning. Meanwhile, the salt situation was getting worse. Brenda had sent out 3 more community emails, each one more aggressive than the last. She'd started a phone tree, encouraging residents to call me and request salt. My phone rang constantly. Most people were nice about it, but enough were hostile that I started letting calls go to voicemail. Then the fines showed up. An official HOA letter delivered to my mailbox, stating that I owed $400 for community welfare violations and had 15 days to pay or face additional penalties. The letter was signed by all 3 board members, though I suspected Margaret and Linda had been pressured into it. I didn't pay. Instead, I sent a certified letter back, formally disputing the fine and requesting a hearing with the full board. The bylaws required them to grant such a hearing within 30 days. Christmas came and went. The snow kept falling. I continued helping elderly neighbors with their walkways, and I sold salt at cost to anyone who asked politely. But I kept detailed records of every transaction, every bag I distributed, and every conversation I had. My dining room table became a command center of folders and printed emails. The response to my records request came in early January. It was a single-page letter from Brenda stating that the documents I requested contained proprietary business information, and that releasing them would violate the privacy of the vendors. She claimed I could view them at the next board meeting if I submitted my questions in writing first. That wasn't how it worked. The bylaws were clear about homeowner access to financial records. I forwarded everything to Marcus, who agreed to write a more strongly worded legal letter on his firm's letterhead. Sometimes all it took was lawyer stationery to make people realize they were screwing up. The hearing about my fine was scheduled for mid-January. It was held at the community center on a Tuesday evening, and about 30 residents showed up, way more than usually attended HOA meetings. Brenda sat at the front table with Margaret and Linda, looking pleased with the turnout. She probably thought everyone was there to support her. "We're here to discuss Derek Peterson's refusal to comply with community welfare standards during a crisis situation," Brenda began. "As you all know, we experienced severe winter weather, and while many residents were struggling, Mr. Peterson hoarded supplies and refused to help his neighbors." "That's not accurate," I said, standing up. "I've been helping neighbors individually. I've given free salt to 5 elderly residents and sold it at cost to anyone who asked politely. What I refused to do was turn over my private property to the HOA for redistribution." "That's a distinction without a difference," Brenda said. You should have made your supplies available to the board so we could ensure fair distribution. Why does the board need to control distribution? Someone called out. It was Tom Morrison from 2 streets over. If Derek's selling it at cost, that seems fair to me. The HOA has a responsibility to manage community resources, Brenda said. But it's not a community resource, Margaret said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She cleared her throat. I mean, Derek bought it with his own money. It's his property. I'm not sure we have the authority to demand he turn it over. Brenda's expression went icy. We've already discussed this as a board, Margaret. I know, but I've been thinking about it and I'm not comfortable with the fine. I don't think it's legally sound. I agree, Linda added, and now Brenda looked genuinely shocked. I went along with it because you said it was clearly within our authority, Brenda, but I've had several neighbors tell me they think we're overstepping. The room erupted in conversation. People were arguing with each other, some defending me, others supporting Brenda's position. I let it play out for a minute before speaking up again. I'd like to make a formal motion to rescind the fine, I said. And I'd like to request a vote from all homeowners, not just the board. That's not how this works, Brenda said. The board has authority over enforcement matters. Actually, Marcus said, standing up in the back row, I hadn't even known he was there. According to the bylaws, any homeowner can request a full membership vote on a board decision if they can get signatures from 10% of households. That would be 24 signatures. And who are you? Brenda demanded. Marcus Sullivan, attorney at law. I'm here as an observer, but I'm familiar with HOA regulations. Derek mentioned this situation to me, and I took an interest. Brenda looked like she'd swallowed something sour. Fine. If Derek wants to waste everyone's time collecting signatures, he can try. This hearing is over. The fine stands unless overturned by a vote. People filed out, but several came up to me afterward, offering to sign a petition. By the end of the evening, I had 32 signatures. I submitted them the next day with another certified letter. Then Marcus's formal letter arrived at Brenda's house, demanding the HOA provide the financial records I'd requested. This time, she couldn't hide behind bureaucratic nonsense. She had 7 days to comply or face potential legal action. I didn't expect what happened next. 3 days later, I got a call from Margaret Foster. Derek, we need to talk. Not officially, just between neighbors. Can I come over? She showed up 20 minutes later, looking nervous. I offered her coffee and we sat in my living room while snow fell outside. I'm going to tell you something that could get me in serious trouble with Brenda, Margaret said. But I think it's important you know. When your lawyer sent that letter requesting financial records, Brenda panicked. She called an emergency board meeting, just her, Linda, and me. She wanted us to vote to hire a lawyer to fight the records request. Did you? No. Linda and I both said we didn't see the point in spending HOA money to hide HOA records from a homeowner. That's when Brenda said something that worried me. She said if we released the contracts, it would open the HOA up to liability because of past accounting irregularities. I set down my coffee mug. What kind of irregularities? She wouldn't elaborate. But Derek, I've been on this board for 2 years, and I've never really looked closely at the landscape contract. I trusted Brenda because she'd been president for 5 years and seemed to know what she was doing. But after that meeting, I went home and started going through old financial reports. The numbers don't make sense. We're paying way too much for landscape services. I noticed that too, I said. Did you know the landscape company is owned by her husband? Margaret's eyes widened. No, that's not disclosed anywhere in our records. Derek, that's a serious conflict of interest. Board members are supposed to disclose any financial relationships with vendors. I think it's more than a conflict of interest, I said. I think she's been inflating the contract to funnel HOA money to her family business. We sat there in silence for a moment. Margaret looked like she might cry. I need to resign from the board. I can't be part of this. Don't resign yet, I said. If you and Linda stay on the board, you have voting power. Brenda can't make decisions unilaterally if you two oppose her. She'll make our lives hell, probably. But if we're right about this, she's been stealing from everyone in this neighborhood for years. That's not just an HOA dispute, Margaret. That's fraud. She left shortly after, but I could tell she was conflicted. I didn't blame her. Taking on an HOA board president was stressful enough without potential criminal implications. The full community vote on rescinding my fine was scheduled for early February. In the meantime, Brenda had to respond to the record's request. When the package arrived, it was clear she'd tried to make it as difficult as possible to understand. Hundreds of pages of poorly organized invoices, contracts with key terms redacted, and financial statements that didn't match the monthly reports sent to homeowners. I spent an entire weekend going through everything with Marcus. We spread it all out on my living room floor, cross-referencing dates and amounts, trying to piece together the full picture. "This is bad," Marcus said, highlighting another discrepancy. "Look at this invoice from April 2023. It says Callaway Landscape Services did extensive spring planting and irrigation repair for $12,000. But the work description is so vague it could mean anything. And look at the photos in the HOA newsletter from that month," I said, pulling up my laptop. The common areas look exactly the same as they did in March. No new plants, no visible repairs. We found pattern after pattern. Invoices for work that was either never done or vastly overcharged. Extra billing for snow removal on days when it hadn't snowed. Emergency repair charges that didn't correspond to any visible improvements in the neighborhood. Over 3 years, we estimated that at least $200,000 had been paid out for questionable or non-existent work. "You need to report this," Marcus said. "This isn't just civil fraud, Derek. If she's been intentionally billing the HOA for services not rendered, that's theft by deception. That's criminal." "I want to be absolutely sure before I bring in law enforcement," I said. "If I'm wrong, I'll look like I'm just retaliating over the salt thing." "You're not wrong. These numbers don't lie, but I understand wanting to be careful. Let me reach out to a colleague who specializes in white-collar crime. We'll get a second opinion." The community vote took place on February 8th. It was held in the community center, and nearly every household sent at least one representative. The fire marshal probably would have shut it down if he'd seen how many people were crammed in there. Brenda called the meeting to order, looking confident. "We're here to vote on rescinding the fine levied against Derek Peterson for community welfare violations. Before we vote, I want to remind everyone what's at stake. If we allow residents to hoard resources during emergencies without any accountability, we undermine the entire purpose of having a homeowners association." "I'd like to speak," I said, standing up. "You've already had your say," Brenda said. "Actually, bylaws state that any homeowner can speak for up to 5 minutes during community meetings," Linda said. She'd been quiet so far, but I saw her give Brenda a hard look. "Derek has the floor." I walked to the front of the room. "I'm not going to relitigate the salt issue. Everyone here knows what happened. What I want to talk about is accountability. Brenda keeps using that word, saying we need to hold each other accountable. So I've been looking into how the HOA itself is being held accountable. Specifically, I've been reviewing our financial records and the contracts we've entered into." Brenda went pale. "This isn't the time or place for that discussion." "I disagree. If we're talking about community responsibility, we should all understand where our dues are going. For example, did everyone know that we're paying $170,000 per year for landscape services? For 2 acres of maintained common space, murmuring rippled through the crowd. That seems high, someone said. It's more than high, it's excessive. And did everyone know that the landscape company receiving that money is owned by Brenda's husband, Richard Calloway? A relationship that was never disclosed to the membership. Now people were really talking. Brenda stood up, her face flushed. "How dare you come in here and make accusations? I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. Facts that are documented in the financial records you were legally required to provide me. Facts that suggest serious financial mismanagement at best and fraud at worst. This is slander." Brenda shouted. "It's only slander if it's false," Marcus called out from his seat. "And Derek has documentation for everything he's saying." The meeting devolved into chaos. People were shouting questions at Brenda, who kept trying to deflect and adjourn the meeting. Finally, Linda stood up and raised her voice louder than I'd ever heard her speak. "Everyone, please. We need order." She waited until the room quieted. "Brenda, these are serious allegations. If there's nothing to hide, then you should be willing to address them directly. Is it true that your husband owns the landscape company?" Brenda's mouth opened and closed. "Yes, but that's not relevant. We've always gotten competitive bids. From whom?" I asked. "I've been through 3 years of records. I don't see any other bids documented." "This is a witch hunt," Brenda said, but her voice had lost its authority. She looked around the room and seemed to realize she'd lost the crowd. "Fine. Vote on the fine. Vote to rescind it. I don't care anymore." We voted. The fine was rescinded by a margin of 87%. But more importantly, a motion was made and passed to conduct a full independent audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years, to be performed by a certified accountant not affiliated with any board member. Margaret volunteered to oversee the selection process. Brenda stormed out before the meeting ended, and she didn't show up to the next board meeting 2 weeks later. She sent a resignation letter via email the day before, claiming personal health reasons. Richard Calloway sent a letter terminating the landscape services contract, effective immediately. That should have been the end of it, but Marcus's white-collar crime colleague had reviewed our documentation, and his assessment was even more damning than we'd thought. He estimated the total fraudulent billing over 5 years at closer to $400,000, and he strongly recommended reporting it to law enforcement. The independent audit, completed in late March, confirmed the fraud. The auditor found systematic overbilling, invoices for services never rendered, and evidence that Brenda had approved payments without board oversight on multiple occasions. The report concluded that there was probable cause to believe criminal activity had occurred. In early April, I sat in a conference room at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office with Margaret, Linda, and 2 detectives who specialized in financial crimes. We turned over everything: the audit report, the financial records, the contracts, and all my documentation of the discrepancies. The detectives listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and told us they'd open an investigation. "These cases can take time," Detective Sarah Morrison warned us. "We'll need to subpoena additional records, interview witnesses, potentially examine personal financial records for both Mr. and Mrs. Calloway. But based on what you've shown us, I think we have enough to move forward." The investigation took 6 months. During that time, life in Meadowbrook Heights was weird. There was a sense of collective betrayal among the residents. We'd all trusted Brenda to manage the HOA responsibly, and she'd been stealing from us the entire time. Some people felt guilty for not noticing sooner. Others were angry at themselves for going along with her authoritarian approach to neighborhood management. The new board, led by Margaret as president, worked hard to rebuild trust. They brought in a new landscape company after a competitive bidding process, and the new contract was less than half what we'd been paying Callaway Landscape Services. They also implemented new financial controls, requiring board approval for any expense over $1,000 and mandatory disclosure of conflicts of interest. As for me, I became something of a neighborhood legend. People called me the guy who brought down the HOA president over rock salt. It was a weird kind of fame, but I didn't mind. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Heights looking for a quiet place to rebuild my life after the divorce, and instead, I'd ended up exposing a major fraud scheme. Life is strange sometimes. In October, nearly a year after the salt incident that started everything, Detective Morrison called me. "Derek, I wanted to let you know that we're moving forward with charges. We have enough evidence to charge both Brenda and Richard Callaway with theft, fraud, and corrupt business practices. The prosecutor is confident we can make the case." "That's good news," I said. "There's more. We've been in contact with the Ohio Attorney General's office, and they're interested in the case because it potentially affects other HOAs using Callaway Landscape Services." Turns out Brenda and Richard were running the same scheme in 3 other subdivisions. The total fraud across all 4 communities is over $1 million. I sat down hard in my desk chair. $1 million, at least. We're still running down all the numbers. The Attorney General wants to bring RICO charges, treat it as an organized criminal enterprise. But here's where it gets interesting for you and the other Meadowbrook Heights residents. There's going to be a class action lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. Every homeowner who paid dues during the period of the fraud will be part of the class. Can we actually get the money back? Depends on what assets the Callaways have and whether they've hidden anything. But the AG's office is optimistic. They've already frozen several bank accounts and placed liens on properties. The arrest happened on a cold November morning, almost exactly a year after Brenda had first marched up my driveway demanding I share my salt supply. Detective Morrison called to tell me about it, knowing I'd want to hear. Brenda and Richard were taken into custody without incident at their home, which turned out to be a pretty nice 4-bedroom colonial in an upscale neighborhood adjacent to Meadowbrook Heights. A neighborhood where they definitely shouldn't have been able to afford a house on Richard's legitimate income from a small landscape business. The news coverage was intense. Local TV stations ran stories about the HOA fraud scheme, and the Columbus Dispatch did a long investigative piece about the lack of oversight in homeowners associations across Ohio. Brenda and Richard's mugshots were everywhere. In Brenda's photo, she had the same pinched, angry expression she'd worn that morning when she demanded my salt, but now there was fear in her eyes too. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. The Callaway's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the Attorney General's office wasn't interested in anything that didn't include substantial prison time and full restitution. In February, 14 months after this whole mess started, the case went to trial. I was called as a witness, which was nerve-wracking but also weirdly satisfying. I testified about the salt incident, about how it had led me to examine the HOA finances, about what I'd found in the records. The prosecutor walked me through my documentation, and every time she entered another exhibit into evidence, I saw the jury members' expressions harden. The defense tried to argue that the landscape services were legitimate and fairly priced, that any overbilling was the result of honest mistakes and poor bookkeeping rather than intentional fraud. But the prosecutor had done her homework. She brought in landscape industry experts who testified that the pricing was 3 to 4 times the market rate. She had former Callaway landscape employees who admitted under oath that they'd been instructed to bill for work they hadn't done. She had bank records showing that the Callaways had used the ill-gotten money to pay for luxury vacations, a boat, and renovations to their home. Most damning of all, she had emails between Brenda and Richard discussing how to inflate invoices and which HOAs would be easiest to deceive. In one particularly egregious exchange, Brenda had written, "These idiots don't even read the financial reports. We could charge them anything." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing came in April. Brenda Callaway received 6 years in prison for fraud, theft, and corrupt business practices. Richard got 7 years because he'd actually performed some of the fraudulent billing through his company. Both were ordered to pay full restitution totaling $1.2 million across all the affected HOAs, plus additional fines and penalties. The class action lawsuit proceeded in parallel with the criminal case. By the time everything was settled, Meadowbrook Heights residents recovered about 60% of the stolen funds, roughly $240,000 divided among the homeowners. It wasn't everything, but it was something. The Callaways' house was sold, their boat was seized, and their bank accounts were drained to pay restitution. I got a check for about $1,000, representing my share of the recovered dues plus interest. It felt weirdly anticlimactic after everything that had happened. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the money. It was in knowing that Brenda's petty authoritarianism and her willingness to abuse her position had finally caught up with her. Marcus and I met for beers the night after sentencing to celebrate. We sat in a sports bar in downtown Columbus, watching the Cavaliers game on TV and rehashing the whole crazy story. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Marcus said, working on his second beer. "If Brenda had just left you alone about the salt, none of this would have come to light. She could have kept stealing for years." "Her ego got in the way," I said. "She was so used to people doing what she said that she couldn't handle someone telling her no. The funny thing is, the salt shortage that started this whole thing, it lasted maybe 2 weeks. By mid-December, every store was fully stocked again. She created a crisis out of nothing and then used it as an excuse to exert control. That's what petty tyrants do. They need crises to justify their authority." We drank in silence for a moment, watching a player make a 3-point shot. Then Marcus raised his glass. "To rock salt, the most consequential winter supply purchase in Ohio HOA history." I laughed and clinked my glass against his. To rock salt. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to normal over the following months. The new board under Margaret's leadership was competent and transparent. They published detailed financial reports every month, held regular open meetings, and actually listened to homeowner concerns. The landscape company they'd hired did good work for a reasonable price. The common areas looked better than they had in years. I still got recognized sometimes at neighborhood events. "You're the salt guy," someone would say, and we'd end up talking about the whole saga. Most people were grateful that I'd been stubborn enough to dig into the finances and persistent enough to see it through. A few people, mostly friends of Brenda's, still thought I'd overreacted and that the criminal prosecution was excessive. But they were in the minority. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd fallen on her walkway that first winter, brought me cookies one afternoon. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. Not just for the salt you gave me, but for everything you did. My late husband always said that HOAs attracted the worst kind of busybodies, but he also said every neighborhood needs at least one person willing to stand up to them. You're that person, Derek. I was just trying to keep my salt, I said, but I was touched. You did more than that. You made sure everyone in this neighborhood got justice. That matters. As the weather warmed and spring turned to summer, I found myself reflecting on the whole experience. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Heights looking for peace and quiet, a place to heal after my divorce and start over. Instead, I'd found myself in the middle of a legal battle that had consumed more than a year of my life. But in a weird way, it had been exactly what I needed. The divorce had left me feeling powerless and beaten down. My ex-wife had controlled everything in our marriage, made all the decisions, and when it ended, I'd felt like I'd lost my ability to stand up for myself. But fighting Brenda, documenting the fraud, seeing it through to prosecution, that had given me back something I'd lost. It reminded me that I had a spine, that I could push back against bullies, that I didn't have to accept other people's unreasonable demands just to avoid conflict. In July, the HOA held its annual summer barbecue at the community center. It was a beautiful evening, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. Margaret had organized games for the kids, and someone had set up a volleyball net. People brought side dishes to share, and the HOA provided burgers and hot dogs. I was manning one of the grills when Tom Morrison came over with a beer for me. "Hell of a year, huh?" "That's one way to put it," I said, flipping a burger. "I've been thinking about something," Tom said. "When Brenda was running things, nobody came to these events. We'd get maybe 20 people if we were lucky. Look around now." I did. There had to be at least 150 people there, families and couples and singles, all mingling and laughing and actually enjoying themselves. "People want to be part of a community," Tom continued. "But not when it feels like living under a dictator. You changed that. By taking her on, by exposing what she was doing, you gave everyone permission to actually live here instead of just existing under HOA rule." "Margaret and Linda did most of the work rebuilding things," I said. "Sure, but you started it. Own that, man." Later that evening, as the sun was setting and the party was winding down, Margaret called for everyone's attention. "I just want to say a few words before we wrap up. This has been a difficult year for our community, but also a transformative one. We learned some hard lessons about oversight and accountability. We also learned that this neighborhood has people who are willing to stand up and do the right thing, even when it's hard." She looked directly at me. "Derek, I know you don't love being the center of attention, but on behalf of the entire board and all the residents of Meadowbrook Heights, thank you. What you did mattered, and we're all grateful." People started clapping, and I felt my face get hot with embarrassment. But I also felt something else, something warm and good. Pride, maybe. Belonging, definitely. After the barbecue ended and I was walking home in the twilight, I thought about that first conversation with Brenda about the salt. How angry and helpless I'd felt, how absurd her demands had been. I'd never imagined that refusing to give up 15 bags of rock salt would lead to uncovering a $1 million fraud scheme and sending 2 people to prison. Life had a way of surprising you like that. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Saw the news. They're using your case as an example in the new HOA regulation bill. You're going to be in Ohio legislative history." I laughed and texted back. All I wanted was to keep my driveway clear. "That's how it always starts," he replied. He was right. It did always start small. A petty dispute over salt, an unreasonable demand from someone with a little bit of power. The choice between going along to avoid conflict or standing firm on principle. I'd chosen to stand firm, and it had cost me time, energy, and stress. But it had also mattered. It had made a difference not just for me, but for hundreds of other people who'd been victimized by the Callaways' greed. The next winter came, and with it more snow. I bought my salt early again, learning nothing from the previous year's drama. But this time, when the first storm hit, something different happened. Neighbors called to ask if I wanted to go in on a bulk order together, splitting the cost and the supply. We ended up with 10 households pooling resources, buying salt in bulk from a wholesaler, and distributing it among ourselves. "This is what community actually looks like," Margaret said, when we were dividing up the bags in my driveway. People working together voluntarily, not being forced to by some authoritarian board president. "I'll drink to that," I said, even though it was 9 in the morning and we were standing in the cold. The landscape company that the HOA had hired, a family-owned business called Green Valley Services, did excellent work throughout the year. They charged $45,000 annually, less than a third of what we'd been paying the Callaways, and the common areas looked fantastic. The owner, a guy named David Chen, actually came to board meetings to present his work and answer questions. It was a revelation to realize how a normal vendor relationship was supposed to function. In March, 2 years after the salt incident, I got a letter from the Ohio Department of Commerce. They'd created new regulations for HOAs in response to the Callaway case, requiring annual independent audits for any HOA with more than 100 homes, mandatory disclosure of conflicts of interest, and a state registry of HOA board members. The letter thanked me for my role in bringing attention to the issue and invited me to speak at a conference about HOA governance. I declined the speaking invitation because standing up in front of hundreds of people sounded like my personal nightmare, but I appreciated the gesture. It was gratifying to know that some good had come from the whole mess beyond just the Meadowbrook Heights community. Brenda and Richard were serving their sentences at different facilities in Ohio. I didn't keep close tabs on them, but occasionally I'd hear updates through the neighborhood grapevine. Apparently, Brenda had tried to appeal her conviction, arguing that the prosecution had been excessive and motivated by personal animus. The appeal was denied. Richard was apparently a model prisoner, working in the prison landscape maintenance program, which struck me as darkly ironic. As for me, I kept living my quiet life in Meadowbrook Heights. I worked my contractor jobs, maintained my house, and got more involved in the community now that it didn't feel like living under authoritarian rule. I joined the Neighborhood Watch program, helped organize the annual yard sale, and even served on a committee to redesign the playground at the community center. My ex-wife heard about the case through mutual friends and sent me a surprising email. "I always knew you had it in you to stand up for yourself," she wrote. "I'm glad you found your backbone, even if it took an HOA president demanding your salt to bring it out. Good for you, Derek." It was a strange email, both complimentary and condescending in that way she'd perfected during our marriage. But I chose to take it as a genuine compliment. I had found my backbone. I had learned to say no to unreasonable demands and to follow through when I knew something was wrong. Those were good lessons, even if they'd come in a weird way. One afternoon in May, I was working in my garage when a car pulled up that I didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s got out, looking around the neighborhood with interest. She walked up my driveway and I set down the drill I'd been using. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Are you Derek Peterson?" she asked. "The one who exposed the Callaway HOA fraud?" "That's me," I said, wondering where this was going. "My name is Patricia Moore. I live in the Riverside Estates subdivision in Cincinnati. We've been having problems with our HOA president, and your case gave me the courage to start asking questions. I've been going through our financial records, and I think something similar is happening in our neighborhood. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about how you documented everything and built your case. I looked at her determined expression and saw myself 2 years earlier, angry and frustrated but not quite sure how to proceed. "Come on inside," I said. "I'll make some coffee and show you what I learned." We spent 3 hours at my dining room table, the same table where I'd spread out all those HOA documents and invoices. I walked Patricia through the process of requesting records, what to look for in financial statements, how to identify red flags, and when to bring in professionals like lawyers and accountants. She took detailed notes and asked smart questions. "Thank you so much," she said as she was leaving. "I've been feeling so alone in this, like I was crazy for thinking something was wrong. But talking to you, seeing that you went through the same thing and that you were right to pursue it, that helps more than you know. Just be prepared," I said. "Once you start pulling this thread, it's going to take over your life for a while. Make sure you're ready for that." "I am," she said firmly. "Our HOA president has been a bully for too long. Someone needs to hold her accountable." After Patricia left, I sat on my front porch and watched the sun set over Meadowbrook Heights. The neighborhood looked peaceful in the golden evening light. Kids were riding bikes, a couple was walking their dog, someone was grilling dinner. It looked like the kind of community people dreamed about when they bought their first house. And it was that kind of community now. But it hadn't always been, and it wouldn't always be unless people stayed vigilant. That was the real lesson from the salt incident and everything that followed. Power corrupts, even small power like running an HOA. And the only defense against corruption is regular people willing to ask questions, demand accountability, and refuse to back down when they know something is wrong. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Morrison. "Volleyball game at the park tomorrow afternoon if you're interested." I texted back, "I'll be there." 2 years ago, I wouldn't have gone. I would have stayed home, avoided getting too involved with the neighbors, kept my head down. But that was before I learned that being part of a community sometimes meant standing up and fighting for it. It meant being willing to be uncomfortable, to challenge authority, to document and persist and see things through to the end. All because Brenda Calloway demanded I share my salt supply and I said no. It really was the most consequential bag of rock salt in Ohio history. Marcus had been joking when he said it, but it turned out to be true. That salt, or really my refusal to give it up on Brenda's terms, had led to criminal convictions, new state regulations, recovered funds for hundreds of families, and a complete transformation of how Meadowbrook Heights functioned as a community. I thought about all the people who'd gone along with Brenda's demands over the years, who'd paid their fines and followed her rules and never asked questions. They weren't bad people. They were just trying to avoid conflict, to keep their heads down, to not make waves. I understood that impulse because I'd felt it too. But sometimes you have to make waves. Sometimes the cost of going along is higher than the cost of standing up. Sometimes a bag of rock salt is worth fighting for, not because of the salt itself, but because of what the fight represents. I went inside and pulled up the folder on my computer where I'd saved all the documentation from the case. Hundreds of files, thousands of pages, representing months of work and stress and determination. I'd kept it all, thinking maybe someday it would be useful as a reference. Turned out I was right. Patricia Moore wasn't going to be the last person who needed help challenging a corrupt HOA. There were going to be others, and I was going to help them because I knew how hard it was to fight that fight alone. I created a new document and started typing up a guide. How to investigate your HOA, a step-by-step manual. I included sections on requesting financial records, identifying red flags, documenting evidence, finding expert witnesses, dealing with board retaliation, and when to involve law enforcement. I worked on it for several hours, drawing on everything I'd learned. When I was done, I posted it to a HOA reform website that had featured my case. Within a week, it had been downloaded over 1,000 times. People started emailing me with questions, thanking me for the resource, telling me their own HOA horror stories. I'd stumbled into becoming an accidental activist for HOA reform, and while it wasn't anything I'd ever planned or wanted, it felt right. It felt like taking something terrible that had happened and using it to help other people. That was about the best outcome I could hope for. The seasons continued to change in Meadowbrook Heights. Summer gave way to fall and fall to winter again. When the first snow came, I bought my salt supply without any drama. I shared it freely with neighbors who needed it, and no one demanded I turn it over to the HOA. The new board had created a voluntary community salt sharing program where people could contribute if they wanted to, but participation was entirely optional. That's how it should have been from the beginning. But Brenda Calloway had never been interested in voluntary cooperation. She'd wanted control, and she'd been willing to abuse her position to get it. In the process, she'd exposed herself and her husband to criminal prosecution and destroyed the comfortable life they'd built on stolen money. I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt sorry for the hundreds of families they'd stolen from, for the community trust they'd violated, for the way they'd turned what should have been a helpful organization into a vehicle for personal enrichment. But Brenda and Richard themselves, they'd made their choices, and now they were facing the consequences. One evening in December, almost 3 years after that first confrontation about salt, I was sitting in my living room reading when there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Margaret standing there with a bottle of wine and a smile. "I come bearing gifts and news," she said. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. We settled in the living room and she poured us each a glass of wine. "So, the news." The state HOA Oversight Board just announced their first round of enforcement actions under the new regulations. They found violations at 15 HOAs across Ohio, including 2 cases of potential fraud that have been referred to prosecutors. "That's good," I said. "The system is working." "It's working because you made it impossible for them to ignore the problem anymore. Derek, I know we've thanked you before, but I wanted to do it again now that some time has passed and we can see the full impact of what you started. You didn't just help our neighborhood. You helped reform the entire system." "I just wanted to keep my salt," I said with a smile. "I know. That's what makes it even better. You weren't trying to be a hero or start a movement. You just refused to accept an unjust demand and you followed through when you discovered something was wrong. That's what real integrity looks like." We drank our wine and talked about neighborhood gossip, upcoming events, and plans for the holidays. It was comfortable and easy, the kind of conversation you have with someone who's become a genuine friend through shared adversity. After Margaret left, I stood at my front window looking out at the snow-covered street. Christmas lights were going up on houses, and the neighborhood looked like something from a holiday card. It was peaceful and beautiful, and it felt like home in a way it hadn't 3 years ago. I'd come to Meadowbrook Heights broken and uncertain, looking for a fresh start. I'd found that fresh start, but not in the way I'd expected. I'd found it by refusing to be pushed around, by standing up for what was right, by doing the hard work of holding corrupt people accountable. And it had all started with rock salt. I laughed quietly to myself, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. Who could have predicted that winter preparation supplies would be the thing that brought down a criminal enterprise? Who could have known that one stubborn contractor saying no to an overbearing HOA president would lead to prison sentences, recovered funds, and legislative reform? Life was strange and unpredictable, full of unexpected consequences and unlikely heroes. I wasn't a hero, not really. I was just a guy who'd bought some salt and refused to give it up on unreasonable terms. But sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering Meadowbrook Heights in a blanket of white. I thought about the past 3 years, about everything that had happened, about where I'd started and where I'd ended up. It had been hard and stressful and sometimes scary, but it had also been worth it. I'd learned that I was stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of standing up to bullies and seeing difficult things through to the end. I'd learned that communities could change and improve when people were willing to demand better. I'd learned that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance could have the biggest consequences. And I'd learned that I should always keep a good supply of rock salt on hand, because you never knew when winter might come early or when refusing to share it might change your entire life. I closed the curtains and headed to bed, feeling content and at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, I could rest knowing that I'd done right by my community, by the other HOA victims across Ohio, and by myself. All because I said no to Brenda Calloway 3 years ago and meant it. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world, one bag of rock salt at a time.